Hello and welcome everyone viewing from Facebook Live and from Zoom. Today's passage is entitled A River Always Runs Through It, Waterways as Conduits for Movement. And in this stage, our guest speaker, Mr. Leandro Poco, will talk about urban heritage through the concept of historical urbanism. Before I hand over the floor to the moderator, who will properly introduce our distinguished guest speaker, we want to remind all our viewers to participate in this session by commenting the place where you're joining us from and to submit questions for our speaker. This question will be addressed at the end. Those who submitted questions for the session, be it via Facebook or Zoom, will have a chance to win a SPAFA souvenir. And without further ado, please welcome the moderator for today's session, Senior SPAFA Program Officer, Ms. Michelle Aguas.
Thank you to our special host. Good afternoon from Bangkok. And today it is my honor to introduce today's guest speaker for this session. So Mr. Leandro Poco is a Philippine registered architect and environmental planner with over 17 years of combined planning and architectural practice experience in both Manila and Singapore. So he completed his MS in Space Syntax, Architecture and Cities degree at University College London's Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment. He also previously completed his MA in Urban Design at the National University of Singapore in 2008. He's also a partner with Leonardo A. Poco and Associates Architects, and he has a keen interest in Metro Manila's historical urbanism. And he is a firm believer that evidence-based planning and design are key in improving Metro Manila's dystopia and addressing the residents' discontents. So, Leandro, how are you?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mitch, for the introduction. I'll get right to it. I'm going to share my screen already.
Yeah, so if you're ready, then the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can you see? Okay. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to open up your discussions related to urban heritage by talking about urbanism on a macro scale. So this is the presentation outline that I'll be having for today. I'll be talking about I'll be introducing the concept of hydraulic cities, and in the context of the Southeast Asian region, and in the specific case of Metro Manila, my home city. Then we'll be talking about concepts in space syntax, and we'll be going over some research findings related to the space syntax study of Metro Manila and its history, and we'll be synthesizing and wrapping things up together to hopefully point to a better direction for the future for urbanism. So the hydraulic theory of civilization was initially written or composed by Wittfogel back in 1957, and his approach was quite interesting because the direction that he took the idea was towards the promulgation of empire and control of the state. So, but if you follow the train of thought, it starts rather benignly, meaning in a less intrusive kind of historical background. So obviously agriculture depends on irrigation, and irrigation is brought about by rivers and waterways that are naturally found in our landscape, because these waterways not only just irrigate but also help us transport farm products and people through boats. This naturally drives settlement and creation of hamlets and villages that eventually become towns and our current cities. Now, one of the challenges of this kind of water-centric or hydraulic development is the need for flood control and resource management and the distribution of resources to control the flooding and to maximize the value of waterways. And that leads to the formation of states and of uh, leadership hierarchies that allocate resources. If you think about it, most of the flood control projects that we have now in our modern world are really state driven, and it requires the resources and the organization of a government to harness all these energies to be able to complete these massive projects. Of course, when civilization is able to harness waterways and control floods, their states and their cities can flourish, leading to more trade and to continuous urban formation as cities grow and coalesce around these along these waterways. Of course, when cities grow and coalesce, their influence gets stronger, civilizations improve and become more powerful, and it leads to the external projection of uh, empire and colonial intent. So I think one perfect example of a hydraulic civilization would be the Dutch. Shown here, this is a historical map of Rotterdam, which roughly translates to a dam on the River Rot. And you can see that the Dutch are quite unique in the way that they harness the waterways and allow waterways to infiltrate the urban settlements and by building canals, uh, either from existing streams or tributaries or by creating new channels that become the basis for their circulation and street networks. So if you zoom out, this is the core of Rotterdam. If you zoom out to the present day core of Rotterdam, this is this area, and you'll see how the rest of the River Rot has been effectively man-made and sculpted to become the basis for and to become the base for what is to be one of the biggest ports in the world, port operations in the world. So Rotterdam is actually it's not just a modern phenomenon. Rotterdam has always been an important port city, even during the height of the Dutch Golden Age, which saw the Dutch hydraulic civilization project their power from these canals to the rivers, out to the sea, and out to the oceans across continents, across different continents. And this pattern is not just seen in Rotterdam. You could see this in Amsterdam itself, with the Amstel River being dammed and controlled by the Dutch to form what would be the core of Amsterdam back in the early days of its settlement. What's interesting about cities is that unlike, well, in terms of the archaeological standpoint, no, with cities, is that cities tend to develop in layers like a tree would, and it's usually the oldest part of the city that's at the core, and it's also the most historically significant part of the city. And you could see how a city grows from that core as it modernizes and expands. And what's interesting with Amsterdam is how even if they've modernized and expanded beyond the historical core, they've kept true to their hydraulic roots by continuously building and creating new canals and new spur lines or new branches for these canals to be able to connect the outer edges of the expanding city. What this points to is that it's not just a adaptation related to transportation, waterways for boats and circulation, but also a matter of hydraulic engineering. I mean, because the Netherlands is a very low-lying country, even below sea level, they really need to introduce a well-engineered system of waterways that allow the water to drain effectively across the land even as the city expands. So the core of Amsterdam, you can see, has that infiltration of canals that connect the River Amstel into the Northern Sea. And it's these canals that interestingly allow you to connect. Uh, if you have the property along the water, your property essentially connects to the broader ocean network outside of the North Sea, because you can take a ship, get into a boat, uh, and go from your lot into a bigger ship and into another, and set that ship into a journey across oceans. And uh, this fingerprint, I mean, this DNA of Dutch hydraulic urbanism also creates this very charming, fine-grained, yet globally connected urban morphology that is very unique to the to Dutch cities. Okay. Uh, so the next topic is the Southeast Asian Mediterranean. Now, uh, Dr. Johannes Widodo, one of my dissertation advisor back when I was in the National University of Singapore, uh, was talking about the concept that Southeast Asia as an entity, as a regional grouping, is actually similar to what the Mediterranean Ocean, Mediterranean Sea was uh, during the rise of Western civilization. It's driven by monsoon trade winds that created a setting for that became a cultural crossroads which allowed different cultures to trade and interact with each other. This this pattern of trade and settlement enabled the kampungs, or the hamlets, which were founded by the local populace, usually also along rivers and waterways, to become entrepots, or emporiums that provided access to the Chinese diaspora from southern China to trade in silk, in ceramics, and other things. Uh, of course, the colonial age, with the entry of colonial powers like the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the Spanish, and the Americans later on, created their own towns and cities, usually across or near the kampungs and the hamlets, to create these initial embryonic cities that were used to trade goods with the hinterland of China and the agricultural production areas of Southeast Asia, with the empire, with the center, the capital cities of empire, which includes the Netherlands, I mean, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, London. Uh, in the case of the Philippines, Acapulco, Mexico, which was their governing center before the Mexicans liberated themselves. It's these same towns and kampungs that eventually become the core of our modern megalopolises, which I will expound on further in this discussion. So this is what Dr. Widodo was talking about. If you think about the Mediterranean Sea, dominated by the Roman Empire, you would, and its present state, wherein the former Roman territories stretching from west to east have now decomposed into independent city-states and nations and civilizations, essentially. All of it was spurred by the trade and access that was facilitated by the Mediterranean Sea. A lot of that also happened and occurred in the historical exchange within Southeast Asia. Of course, the difference is that they were writing much more about it, and because our civilization is very Western oriented, there's a better background history about it compared to our region in Southeast Asia. But essentially, it's the same. That's why the South China Sea, if you think about it in Mediterranean terms, should be a common ground, a common waterway shared by all these different cultures that have some commonality across the different countries and islands and peninsulas. So flipping it around again, the reason why monsoon winds were very critical is because they blowed, they they varied across according to the season. So during the northeast monsoon season, they from around October to February or March, they'd blow this way from northeast to southwest, and then during the southwest monsoon season, they'd be coming around May to maybe September, blowing from this direction. And it's these changing trade winds that created this movement, this back and forth movement between the northern and southern parts of the Southeast Asian Mediterranean Sea. And a lot of the traders that came and went had to stay in these towns and cities while waiting for the trade winds to pick up so that they can travel home. And this is the one that this phenomenon of having to wait for the trade winds to shift actually created this Chinese diaspora and cultural admixture that you'd see across different countries. And that's also why there are common threads between us ASEAN nations and of course with the Chinese diaspora. Now, Manila was a perfect example of this settlement, wherein you have the Pasig River opening up to the Bahia Manila, Manila Bay, and what happened was the original base of original local outposts were found in San Nicolas and Tondo, the Kingdom of Tondo, and Raja Soliman used to have a fort where Intramuros was founded. And then the Spanish came and settled there, and of course Binondo is where the Chinese traders, the Sangli Chinese traders that were brought here by the trade winds. So it's these elements that combine together to form the core of what was to be Manila's colonial downtown. This core now has exploded and become a much bigger megalopolis as it expanded to over time. No? And you'll see this street network, the circumferential street network wrapping around the old core of the city as it expanded. You see that pattern mirroring itself in cities like KL in Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur, where you see the River Klang, really just a very narrow stream, that eventually became the base for the foundation of the starting point for the foundation of KL. That confluence becomes the core of Kuala Lumpur. But you will see also as the city grows and expands, the highways start mimicking the riverways, the waterways that drained that valley of water. And you would see how waterways essentially are like analogs to highways back in the the earlier days of urban settlement. The Singapore River is an example of this also. I mean, the Singapore River used to be the main port. That portion here, that curving portion here, is actually used to be the main port of Singapore. Before all of this was reclaimed, this was the edge of Singapore's island form, and trading ships would actually dock outside of that river, and sampans would be the ones that ferry goods and products from the dock to and from the dock and the ships. And of course, in Bangkok, the Chao Phraya is it's a long winding river that actually is also the base of Bangkok as it has grown. And what's interesting about Bangkok is how its branches and tributaries feeding into and out of the Chao Phraya River are still actually used as waterways for circulation and cargo and trade and ferrying people. As you can see, the floating markets are quite far from the main Chao Phraya River itself, but it just goes to show how far deep inland the canals or the clones of Chao Phraya reached into. Now, talking about Metro Manila's context, you see, this was the first colonial settlement in Intramuros that the Spanish built. And you'll see this pattern of walled enclosure. So this is supposed to be a fortress that limited people from entering and exiting the city. And as a walled enclosure, you would see that pattern appearing in our urban fabric today when you see Google Street View, and you see how there are voids in the spatial fabric, and you can see how all of this correlate to private gated villages that on the edges of our metropolis. This echoes the first enclave of Intramuros, which in Spanish translates to within the walls. The present day context is that right now, these private developments are all interconnected by a highway system called Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, or C4. So it's very car centric. It's very highway centric planning. Because at the scale of the metro region, there's no notion of pedestrian connectivity, because everyone has to rely on the car. At that time, during the 50s and 60s, the car was seen as the solution to congestion in the downtown cores. So we see that rearing its ugly head nowadays with the proposed Pasig River Expressway, which, as you can see here, this is actually sourced from the actual report submitted by San Miguel Corporation, the proponent for the project, to the Environmental Management Bureau of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So it's supposed to run along the Pasig River, on top of it, actually, in some sections, and bypassing a portion beside the presidential palace for safety, and resuming the route along the river or on top of the river, right beside Intramuros and across Chinatown or Binondo. So one can see how this echoing of long-range connectivity by the river is being repeated nowadays, but in the form of a car-centric expressway. In a way, the role that the river served to connect people, goods, and services across long ranges of movement is replaced by this infrastructure. So I'll take a detour first and talk about space syntax and the key concepts. So the heart of space syntax is how how space can be represented as axial lines, drawn as the straightest, longest lines that passes through any system of spaces. So each sheet or segment of a sheet, if it's curving, can be represented by axial lines, like this one, to represent this. You can also use axial lines to represent space within buildings. So these axial lines are actually, in a way, hidden in how we perceive space when we move in cities. So this is an example of what the projected axial line looks like if you were walking on a streetscape in a city. This is important because since humans have eyes in front of their heads, it means we see and perceive space in lines, and we move and follow these lines through space. So each street is represented as an axial line and then counted as a node, which, when grouped together according to their connections, form a network that can be mathematically analyzed. So we're actually not analyzing the buildings itself or the intersections, we're analyzing the actual streets as connections in a spatial graph. And this analysis of the spatial network generates specific properties which has mathematical property. So the two most important relevant to the study is the closeness centrality and the betweenness centrality. Closeness means closeness centrality means you're the easiest to get to. You're the easiest destination, most common destination. because you're adjacent to or close to the most number of adjacent nodes. And then the betweenness centrality is what you would see, what you would have if you okay, what you would encounter if you were forced to pass through going from left to right in this graph, in this specific graph. So what's interesting is how the betweenness centrality is different from the closeness centrality, but sometimes they align together. A betweenness centrality is, let's say, a gate where everyone has to pass, or a lobby where everyone has to pass to enter a space. That's a betweenness centrality. So what is space syntax for? It's very useful in exposing the underlying spatial configuration of cities. It allows us to strip away all the layers of a city, to remove the branding, historical narratives, perceptions, and surface the latent patterns, spatial patterns of a city. And we will, in doing so, we can discover how space actually tends to drive human interaction and social relations. So space syntax has been used to analyze archaeological sites like Teotihuacan and other historical settlements in the pre-colonial Americas. By using space syntax, researchers are able to bring out embedded sociospatial knowledge that is not necessarily discussed or found in the historical record. So, I mean, lost civilizations have very limited written records, but by using space syntax on the dwellings and the spaces that they occupied, we could unravel or surface certain connectivities that could explain why certain buildings are more important or certain spaces became focal points for the community, even if they're not necessarily the center of that settlement. In a way, it lets us relive and experience the daily life of these historical cities. Now, key concepts of space syntax. First is natural movement follows accessibility. So it's quite common sense, right? The more accessible a space is, the more easy it is to connect to something, the more likely will traffic follow the same path. So it's called natural movement. And in this example, this is Tianjin in China. They modeled the street network, and they're able to show with a 72% correlation that if you're not counting yet the attractors or the magnets of activity like hospitals or business districts, the spatial network correlates with the traffic volume. So the red segments in the spatial network actually carry more traffic in the system. The next concept is the idea of a movement economy. Movement economies tend to aggregate, or businesses tend to aggregate where natural movement occurs. Again, common sense again, but you could see that if you have something accessible on paper, if you can analyze a space on paper, then you can predict where commercial opportunities can occur. So straight away, there are potentials for this methodology in real estate. But there's also such a thing as a negative movement economy, wherein, of course, when trade and exchange occurs within the city, you also open yourself up to antisocial behavior like crime. And you can see here that all these little dots here are shops of different kinds, no? And they aggregate along the warm segments of the street network of downtown London. And you'll see that a lot of these white clouds are crime hotspots. And the crime hotspots, or these negative movement economies, are just one or two street turns away from these very active and busy areas. And it's a very good example of what a negative movement economy is, because these two go along together. The same way that a retail store looks for foot traffic, it's been found out that drug dealers also look for foot traffic. And they usually just stand one or two or three turns away from a high street. So this has influenced how the the Metropolitan Police has changed their patrol patterns. Rather than patrolling on the high street, they decided to shift their resources by patrolling on the edges around the high street, because the high street tends to take care of itself with a lot more people on the high street and shop fronts facing the high street. The next concept is the difference between order and structure. So um, humans tend to impose a pattern of order on spaces. So we tend to define, like for example, classically planned parks had rigid grids that you expect people to promenade through. But in reality, that's not how people use space. So, like in this university campus, people would walk through the lawn and create these desire lines, and this unveils the bottom-up structure of how people want to use the space. So, getting tired of having to resod the lawn, they just paved it over and turned that into the part of the imposed order of the lawn. You can see this also similarly in ancient Iranian cities, which seem disorderly, with very fine-grained networks of streets and chaotic street networks. But you could see that a lot of the integration cores, or the heart of the circulation network in red, the warmest parts of the circulation network, actually correlate with where the bazaars or the markets are. So it highlights how bottom-up structure is a consequence of human behavior and how we perceive space. And there is usually a disconnect between how we plan and impose an order versus how we want to use a space and experience a space. So now to my research findings. Hold on. Okay, for the research findings, the Spanish founded the walled city of Intramuros in 1571. Now, notice how the 1898 map is oriented from Manila Bay. That was the primary point of access and orientation because they approached from the sea, part of the hydraulic nature of cities. Notice also how Intramuros is drawn as the center of Manila. The Spanish were asserting their dominance and imposing order on the space, with a defensive buffer of the Pasig River and Luneta around it. This is an example of that order being imposed on the fabric of the surrounding settlements. The popular interpretation is that by placing Intramuros as the center of the city, its guns are positioned not just to defend the mouth of the Pasig River, but also aimed at the traditional native settlements across and surrounding it like a panopticon. Inside Intramuros, the Spanish planned it to be a walled tropical reproduction of a European town, designed to protect colonists from invasion and rebellion. As shown in the 1851 map of Intramuros, it follows the Cartesian grid decreed by King Philip's Laws of the Indies. The grid was ordered around the Plaza Mayor, with other separate churches and plazas within the walled town. Access going into and out of the walled city are through specific puertas or gates, strategically located as shown. This 1851 map is translated into an actual spatial network graph and analyzed for different ranges of travel. And this particular graph shows global integration or near centralities and shows which segments are the most accessible as destinations to and from all other segments in the whole system. In a way, this gives us a view of how the typical colonist resident of Intramuros saw the world within the walls of Intramuros. Everything else outside of the walled city is cool and peripheral to the civic society and court, the urban community formed within the walls and the social interaction within the walls. Now, each of these points of interest are actually actual buildings, no? And have different uses, and all have different accessibility values. And you can see that the blue ones, which stand for government buildings, were all positioned in very important areas or very accessible areas. Now, the interesting thing is the only commercial point of interest that was the Spanish map is the panaderia, which, according to historical record, the panaderia or the bakery is actually a royal franchise or grant. So it was awarded a monopoly to produce bread on a daily basis. And you will see that it's not located in the civic core. It's actually located along the busiest street of Intramuros, mirroring the need that for commercial activity to follow movement. The most accessible or integrated street is supposed to be the most prime for commercial activity, and that's where the panaderia located itself, even if it had the monopoly to produce and sell bread. Interestingly, this spatial accessibility, you will find the same clustering up to today. No, so these are food shops, F&B stores, and restaurants that have located themselves along the same paths, close to the same paths of high accessibility found in Intramuros. Now, immediately outside Intramuros, the Sanglis or the Chinese traders flourished as trade with the Spanish grew. First settling on Binondo, the Sanglis then moved by 1851 onto the first Parian district just outside of Intramuros called the Arroceros or the Rice Market. But because the Spaniards feared assassination, plague, and fire because they're close to their city, their walled city, they moved them back to Binondo, to that island, Isla de Binondo, and that became the first established Chinatown in the world in 1594. This officially marks Spanish social exclusion against the Sangli Chinese traders. The Sangli is a word that denotes a Filipino, a local Filipino with Chinese ancestry. So similar settlements around Intramuros. So it's not just in Binondo, but you will also see it in Ermita, in Malate, in San Nicolas, in Quiapo, and all these areas here. Now, similar settlements around Intramuros became suburbs or arrabales, and these are mission areas for church building. This policy was known throughout the Spanish Empire as reducciones, which was implemented through the forced relocation of indigenous populations into church-centered towns, such as this one. No? This is the reduction of San Juan Bautista in Paraguay. These reducciones formed a network of missions across the Spanish Empire to replicate the parochial society of Christian Europe through the synchrony of church bells and rites throughout the liturgical calendar. These missions were administered through a farm labor right system called encomiendas, wherein missionary friar orders or grantee colonists or local sangli or mestizo chieftains were assigned farmland for labor and production by the populace of each church. This effectively privatized, semi-privatized control of the land, and this was implemented outside of Manila in what was later to become the Tuason Hacienda to the northeast. This is a rough outline. The Ortigas Hacienda to the east, and the Rojas and Sobel de Ayala Hacienda in Makati to the southeast. Now, zooming back into Manila and its Parian districts, these reducciones were centered around church plazas, and you'll see the churches in white are very close to the hot accessible cores of each reducciones. As you can see, these plazas served as venues for social activity, and as you can see up to now, no, this is Quiapo in Manila. What Catholics do in Spain, we can likewise do with even more bravado and flavor here in Manila. And as shown in the 400-meter radius of analysis, these churches are all in very locally integrated areas, and therefore served a walking population to make sure that they prayed and they followed the church bells, and the church bells called them to prayer throughout the day. Now, The detailed tabulation of each of Manila's churches in 1851 shows evidence that the churches located outside of Intramuros have higher accessibility at 400-meter range of analysis compared to the rest of the network. So it means that the religious network or the churches outside of Intramuros were more accessible to pedestrians than the churches inside Intramuros. So it means that the churches outside of Extramuros were really meant to cater to the locals that they resettled close by. This presents evidence of the spatial localization imposed on the surrounding fabric as part of the Reduzione system. Now, even with the soft power projection in the form of racial exclusion and the Reduzione system applied onto Binondo and the Parian districts, the Spanish still made sure to project hard power over the surrounding fabric outside of Intramuros. So these white points now that you see are actually forts and cartels or camps, which the Spanish used as to house their military police or their security network. So this network of cuartels and campos and baluartes or forts and similar fortifications are all found and located specifically along routes leading into or out of Intramuros and into and out of Binondo to monitor and control the Sangli population, and along routes leading to Malacanang Palace along Escolta and San Miguel, and also facing the bay. No? So this is Fort Abad, which is overlooking Manila Bay, which is, it's a security. It's designed for security to protect the settlement from attack from the sea. This tabulation of value shows how the average route choice value of these camps and forts are higher than the surrounding fabric of outside of Intramuros. And it shows how all these military camps are positioned to project power on the populace and to protect the settlement. Now, even though the Spanish drew Intramuros as the center of Manila, as the ordered center of Manila, the global integration or closeness centrality analysis of 1898 Manila shows that the true underlying structural center of Manila, which is the most accessible core, is Binondo, across the river from Intramuros. And you'll see that, like any gated enclave or walled community, Intramuros is actually very low in integration and not very accessible. All the action happened in Intramuros, in Binondo. What this points to is that there's an underlying spatial advantage enabling the Sangli Chinese traders to form what effectively became Manila's primary trading district. The irony of this is not lost on many Chinese Filipinos, especially since the legacy of discrimination and exclusion was still felt, up till recently. The Sangli Chinese Filipinos were relocated and marginalized by the Spanish, and by circumstance also eventually become the most primarily positioned in the city, becoming the core or the beating heart of colonial Manila. Binondo Shopping Street, Calle Escolta, shown here in 1899 after the Americans took over with the American flag, takes its name. Calle Escolta takes its name from the royal escorts that were camped just outside of it, just beside it, called in a place called Cuartel de Soda, on a side street of Escolta. Various historical accounts say that Escolta was the path that the Spanish Governor General took as he commuted from his residence in Malacanang into Intramuros and back. The Spanish Governor Generals did not want to live in the intrigue of the walled city, and so they stayed away. Because Escolta, and now because the guards were headquartered beside Escolta, it felt safe to colonists to visit, and it became the shopping district for colonists as they felt safe to transact with the locals. Escolta could be called Spanish Manila's first secured shopping mall, with the royal escorts, the first private Blue Guard. Now, one aberration to Binondo's high spatial values is the Alcasera de San Fernando, or the Chinese silk market, which is this octagonal structure found here in the map, which is located here. It was constructed as the first and largest commercial structure built by the Spanish in Manila. It can be seen in the 1898 map of Manila as that octagonal structure just outside of Binondo's active core, and it looks to be inaccessible and does not have the same high accessibility values as part of Binondo. So the Alcasera de San Fernando actually served as a home base for the Chinese traders the silk traders coming from southern China. As they came in, they traded, and they waited for the change in the monsoon to be able to travel back to China. So, as part of this exclusionary policy, the Chinese traders were housed in that same space and prevented from exiting and interacting with the populace. Of course, I guess that's the policy, but I'm sure eventually a lot of them were able to move around. This building is now lost to history, and unfortunately, it was built on top of the site. There's an existing elementary school, so this is actually the historical marker of found in that elementary school. It would be interesting to see or to dig to find out if there are any historical artifacts of this very important structure. It was burned down, I think, during I'm not sure if it was during World War II or even before that. So I found a hint as to why the Alcasera seemed cut off from the rest of the grid when I was reading about Daniel Burnham's impressions of Manila right after the Spanish to American colonial turnover. He pointed out that Manila, and I paraphrase, had the Bay of Naples, the canals of Venice, and the River of Paris. And Dr. Sofia Sara, one of our professors at the Bartlett, published her book called The Venice Variations, wherein she included the canals as part of the spatial network in her analysis. So you could see that she did not just analyze the streets inside Venice, but she included the canal itself, the Grand Canal, and all the little canals as part of the spatial network that she analyzed for Venice. And to understand why the Alcasera had such a low integration value, as shown here, so this is the Alcasera, it's only 0.58, whereas the average market value is about 0.74 for the whole system and 0.75 for outside the system, outside of Intramuros. I included to understand that, I included the Pasig River and all the little esteros outside of Intramuros. And you will see that just with that change in analysis, you could see that the river, Pasig River and the esteros, actually led to the increase in accessibility values of that same silk market. From 0.58, it becomes 1.01. It's actually the most accessible part of the city from the waterway. And it shows and it proves that during that time, you cannot analyze the spatial network simply by looking at the roads, but also by accounting for the waterways as the conduits for commercial activity. Now, expanding on this, you could also see how all the different the dots here that you can see are commercial points of interest. So these are other markets outside of the city, and you'd see that as a pattern, all of their accessibility values effectively increase when you account for the spatial network, when you account for the waterways as part of the spatial network. And you'd see that because a lot of them are actually located in areas that are not necessarily accessible from streets, but are actually more accessible from waterways. And then contrasting further, you can see how, if we zoom in, Um, so this dot, I mean this star here is actually the Puerto Magallanes, or the galleon port, which the Spanish used as a dock for the galleons that traveled from Manila across the Pacific to Acapulco, Mexico. This was this was the main link connecting the Philippines to the rest of the Spanish Empire. And you could see that the Puerto de Magallanes actually had the lower accessibility value, lower integration value compared to Alcasera, the Alcasera Silk Market. And it goes to show that the local trade, or the local regional trade, took more precedence and was more important for the lifeblood of the city relative to the commercial exchange that the Puerto Magallanes created. Partly, this is because Puerto Magallanes really just served the Spanish colonists, because it's just outside of the walled city of Intramuros, whereas all the other markets along the Pasig River serve the rest of the populace. So, understanding the interconnectedness of the Pasig River system and its various tributaries, one can see how this waterway network served as the superhighways that connected Manila's encomiendas and haciendas. Not only did the Pasig River system connect Manila's towns and farmland, one could see how these also connected to the many mission districts, mission towns and farmlands established on the banks of the Laguna de Bay along here. It was the semi-privatized encomiendas and haciendas that were to become the backbone of colonial agrarian and industrial production and the base for export of goods to Mexico and China. So, synthesizing all of this together, you will see that the phenomenon of Bangkok's floating markets being far away from the core of from the main Chao Phraya River is simply a consequence of how far the klongs extended beyond the Chao Phraya River. And the fact that the existing floating markets are still alive and vibrant today is a sign that Bangkok has not forgotten its hydraulic history. Its use of the waterways is still very relevant today. And it's something that's waiting to be tapped and maximized with better water transport and access to, and maybe better flood control as well. In the local context of Metro Manila, you can see how the esteros, or the channels that strengthen Binondo, located here, are now being paved over, and in a grander sense, the main Pasig River itself is also being planned to be paved over or constructed with a viaduct over it. It mirrors the conversion from waterways as global long-range transport towards highways as long-range transport, and it's a sign of just how car-centric and how dominant this form of movement and economy is in our current time. Will we allow ourselves to evolve the same way that Kuala Lumpur expanded its highway network? Will we end up like this? Or do we rationalize our infrastructure the same way that Singapore did? You know, when Singapore, back in the 50s, 60s, the Singapore government decided to transfer the port. So what used to happen here on the docks of the Boat Quay was transferred out to Tanjong Pagar, and that became the bigger base, the port base for Singapore, and it allowed them to free up all the old shop houses and warehouses to become the new gentrified historical district that became a entertainment and F&B recreation area for the city. These changes are needed, and this vision and long-range planning and effort to turn what used to be a utilitarian back of house space into a front of house space by transferring and relocating things further away. We have the opportunity to do that in Manila. I mean, the Batangas port and Subic ports have always been penciled as better locations. But of course, there's a lot of inertia in Manila to keep the port operations there, because so many people depend on the port as their livelihood for their livelihoods. Paris also shows how a city can engage with its waterways by building so many crossings crossing bridges across the river Seine, effectively unifying both banks of the River Seine. This is something that we do not have currently in the Pasig River because our bridge crossings are too few and far apart. By creating more bridge crossings rather than creating this long snaking expressway, maybe we could unify the northern and southern banks of the Pasig River and create a more unified city that that spans the river and that doesn't treat the river as a back of house space or as a canal, but as a urban promenade that is very vibrant and marks one of the most beautiful parts of Paris. That's it. Salamat po. Thank you for having me. And we're now open for Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Leandro, for your presentation. So now that, it's time to proceed with the questions and answers from our viewers. So there's one question posted asking about Pasig River. So this is the exact question. Has the Pasig played that role of a major transport route for people and goods? Because he feels that in his lifetime, he never felt any attempts to use it to actually transport people. And it seems that it never has caught on. So what's stopping it from achieving that? Is it like the water lilies or the trash or the garbage that affects that? Or are there other factors that come into play?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, I might have to show my screen again. Let me get to that. The reason why I might have to show the screen again is because, well, of course, I did not include the slide, but anyway. Okay, so that question came in before I discussed the historical analysis of Pasig, the Pasig River. So the answer is yes, it was actually used as the main conduit and thoroughfare for goods and people in the historical, in our colonial times, maybe up till World War II. Okay. But after World War II, we saw the development of EDSA and the rapid suburbanization outside of Metro Manila. And I think this is one of the things that we have to be conscious of. Part of the reason why Pasig is not seen as a very viable route is not just the water lilies. The water lilies is just a small bit of the problem. It's the land use along the Pasig River. If you look at the original historical land use of the Pasig River, a lot of the big parcels and cuts along the Pasig River are actually industrial land. And because these are industrial land, these big chunks of land are locked in and prevents crossings between two sides of the bank and prevents direct access for people to get to the edge of the river. And also because these are industrial parcels, they're still used as industrial parcels now. There's still manufacturing plants or disused manufacturing that is along the riverside. There's no compelling reason to channel people uh, along the waterway and to feed into these parcels. You need to give people a good reason to move on a certain corridor. And the main problem is that there's a land use disconnect between the waterway and the banks. So, like in most countries, you'll see that for you to be able to convert land use along the waterways, you really need to have a conscious effort to change that land use from industrial into something else. And that's very disruptive and can be traumatic for the residents along that waterway, because industrial use also comes with it informal settlement and so on and so forth. So this is where gentrification becomes a good and bad device for changing the city. But if you want to be able to make the Pasig River the front of the city again, we need to change the land use, and by doing so, we will give people a reason to use boats along the river. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like just on what you talked about, like I guess that explains like up until just a few years ago, or maybe the last 2 decades, or maybe even a decade ago, that explains why up until then the oil refinery, right?
Yeah.
Along the Pasig River was still there. And growing up, like I was always wondering, why is it there? Like I would think it would be in a location outside Manila, but it was there. And yeah, so that explains it. And then obviously it took time for for people to realize that no, we have to move this, we have to change the location already, or yeah, I mean obviously as a means of development, or at least yeah, changing the use of the space.
Actually, Daniel Burnham, when he came in, I just don't have that slide because that's for another talk. But Daniel Burnham, when he came in and created the Burnham Plan of Manila, his intention for the Pasig River, the banks of the Pasig River, was to be used as promenades and road streets for residents and commercial use. But that plan was changed in implementation by Parsons and Harry Frost and all the American colonial planners that came after Burnham, because they acknowledged that the city at that time needed industrial land. Because in industrial land at that time, there was no other way for you to carry large volumes of goods. There was no way at that time for you to dispose of the sewage of industrial plants apart from dumping it into the waterway. That's why they ended up parceling these portions, what used to be farmland, into industrial parcels and turning Pandacan into the oil terminal and grain terminals all up and down the Pasig River. So yeah.
Yeah, that's the area, Pandacan. So there's just a follow-up question from that one. So nowadays, are they still being used as an industrial means for transport?
Yes, they're still used. Actually, there are still grain terminals and fuel terminals along the Pasig River. Barges are still going up and down the river.
Right.
I'm not a harbor master myself. I'm a landlubber, but I know for a fact, because I've worked with people in the port area, with businesses in the port area, that the Pasig River is still used for delivering goods and services to the industries that are alongside.
Okay.
Maybe not to the same extent, just to a lesser extent na lang.
Yeah, but yeah, it should be still the same, because yeah, I do still see barges like traversing along the river, but yeah, definitely not as before. So we have another question. Is there a way to rehabilitate or fully utilize the waterways in Metro Manila, specifically the Pasig River?
Well, for me, there's no magic bullet. to this? First of all, we need to acknowledge, because I'm sorry to say, but there has been efforts to negate the recent successes and efforts to clean the Pasig River. People are saying that it's a dead river. So why are you caring about it all of a sudden now when we're about to build an expressway on top of it? It's a little bit of gaslighting, a whole populace, when there has been a Pasig River Redevelopment Commission, which was abolished, by the way, that had actually done some good work already to rehabilitate. And now there is life in the Pasig River again, in the tributaries of the Pasig River. So a lot of that is actually in danger of being lost because of, because of this influx of new infrastructure. Now, so first we have to acknowledge that there has been efforts and there has been success, and there's a need to continue it. We cannot allow ourselves to be gaslighted by believing that it's a dead river. No, that's number one. Number two, there also needs to be a conscious effort by the governments, by the LGUs. See, the problem with, you'll know this, the Filipinos will know this. I guess the Thais will also know this, because I know Bangkok has the same problem. The issue with Metro Manila is the problem of jurisdiction. So a river cuts through many political jurisdictions, and I know Chao Phraya and its tributaries have the same issue. Manila is no different. The Pasig River is no different, and it takes a concerted effort by each of these jurisdictions to really assess and turn around change the land use, and in a quality way, and bring in pedestrian-centric infrastructure, quality pedestrian-centric infrastructure that benefits more people. The Philippine population only 12% of the Philippine population owns a car, and yet so much of our metropolitan infrastructure is devoted to the car. A Pasig River with that has its banks converted into a bike expressway or a bike corridor would do wonders for bike commuters, and more pedestrian crossings and bike crossings across the Pasig River would also do wonders for local communities that have been cut off from one side to the other. So there's no magic bullet, but we need to map very clearly how we're going to do it, and it starts by acknowledging the fact that there has been success.
Yeah, and I guess there's now the initiative, right? We have to acknowledge that the initiative's already there.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So we have a few more questions. So another question is, where do you think we should start with to encourage our cities or communities to treat backyards facing waterways as front yards? And then I will say something in Filipino if the other viewers don't mind, because maybe we term it as likuran, that we treat it also as palikuran.
Yeah. That's an unfortunate thing, no? That when you say it's the back of house, we treat it as the back of house. But again, this is part of what good housekeeping is. If people cared, if the governments cared, and simply did not treat the populace living beside the waterways as their voter base, then they would house them, relocate them within the city, treat them well, in order to be able to free up land and rework those waterways into something better. There's no magic bullets to this. It's really just good city governance and long-term implementation, both of which are hampered by our electoral system and modes of government. So it's really a challenge. That's why enlightened governance has to take this on and and push the initiatives to the people so that the people are the ones who take ownership of this change.
Yeah, and obviously it's not just it doesn't stop at being long term. It has to be sustainable, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So another question is, could the new Clark City be the new trading or economic hub in the Philippines, considering its proximity to the Clark Freeport and Subic Bay Freeport zones?
Uh, the history of our capitals is quite unique, no? Our original capital was Intramuros, then it became the capital moved outside of Intramuros into what was supposed to be Rizal Park with the government center, and then the Americans realized, hey, it doesn't make sense to put a it doesn't make sense to put a capital complex beside a bay which could be bombed or uh, shot at from the sea, you know. So they realized they need to relocate it and they moved it to Quezon City. And then, so we weren't even able to create any critical mass. We moved to Quezon City, and then Quezon City, okay, there was some conscious effort to transfer institutions to Quezon City, but even that effort is half-hearted because the president never relocated, the Senate never relocated, all the other institutions never relocated, and now there's this effort to transfer to Clark in the name of disaster resiliency. We have to understand that hubs and capitals are political gestures and statements. We cannot pretend that it's purely just infrastructure. Yet,
Mm.
I hope you understand what I'm implying. But there's nothing wrong with having another hub. The way I see it is Manila. It's not an either or. The problem with this duality that the public is talking about now is that Manila is so crowded, we should decentralize. Don't you realize that Metro Manila's crowdedness is itself an asset? By being crowded, we are generating efficiencies in scale. The problem is we're not allocating space efficiently. So the problem of Metro Manila cannot be solved by transferring things outside of Metro Manila. What needs to be transferred outside of Metro Manila is economic vibrancy. We need to distribute the action so that people have less need to relocate to Metro Manila. The reason why people relocate to Metro Manila is because that's where all the action is.
Mm.
So this discourse about decongesting, it's a false premise, I think. Now, can't Clark coexist with a vibrant Manila? Why not? So it's not either or. Both can exist at the same time in the same multiverse of cities. Yeah.
Okay, so we have some more questions. So another question. So the next one is, what do you think about making Manila a sponge city, considering the natural waterways piercing through the city and the water surrounding it?
The sponge city concept is ideal on paper if you start maybe from scratch. Maybe Clark would be a great and I know for a fact that Clark has active green and blue infrastructure. The main park spine and waterway of Clark is designed as a sponge. So it requires a departure from traditional thinking. Let me stop sharing. It requires a departure from the way we see waterways and cities as purely gray infrastructure. Yes. The way civil engineer is trained is to drain roads of flooding as quick as possible and to discharge water as quick as possible to the waterways. This creates higher runoff velocity, and in doing so, uh, increases the risk of flooding. So this paradigm of gray infrastructure is now being reassessed worldwide and is now being observed as redirected towards green and blue infrastructure. So the idea is rather than putting more infrastructure that speeds up gray water or rainwater, why can't we have river banks that are porous or parks that are porous or roadside bioswales that are porous to be able to absorb water and hold water rather than discharging it into a waterway. The problem with Manila is everything is paved already. So unless we're willing to break some roads and turn them into swales, or unless we're willing to leave very important open spaces, very important and valuable real estate into parks, it's still possible. It could be a matter of policy. Then it would be very difficult to do. So the alternate to that, to this sponge city concept, is to engineer it. That's why in areas around Manila, like in UST and University of Santo Tomas, a very flood-prone area, they actually have underground cisterns that are meant to catch the rainwater and hold it before pumping it out to the drainage system. In a way, it's like a sponge, except that it's very engineered, and it's not the same sponge that you're imagining that's all green and blue, you know. So and it's very costly also because it's all infrastructure. So the use cases for this are very limited, and but at the end of the day, the technology, the know-how, the technical skill is there. All the things that we need to do to solve things, to solve problems, the reality is it's been done outside of the country. So it's a matter of learning how it's done and technically applying the skill required to do this. But the problem is that it's not about the skill or the know-how. It's about the political decision to solve it. It's always about the policy, whether the political and economic policy, whether or not the leaders will acknowledge that, hey, we need to do this. If we don't do this, of course, it also comes with the vested interests and the interests of the business community. These things have to align for us to be able to implement these solutions. Now, if these do not happen, then we will all be flooded. They'll be making money, but we'll be flooded. So yeah.
Okay, we have some more questions actually. So another question would be, based on your studies and research, has there been any historical or archaeological records and evidence of waterways during the pre-colonial period in the Philippines?
I think in terms of pre-colonial times, no, to be honest, the Spanish did a good enough job of erasing a lot of our records from the past. So I have to acknowledge my limitations. I'm an architect and an urban planner. My knowledge of the historical record and the archaeological record of waterways in Manila is not as deep as someone who's an archaeologist or historian. But I think the esteros have always been vital. The canals that serviced Binondo and San Nicolas have always been vital in the city, even before the Spanish came.
Yeah, but I guess that's also like a good way to like see how the disciplines would interplay, right? So obviously the archaeological stories and history, how it will interplay with what you've been doing in urban planning and space syntax. So definitely that's something we can explore.
In a way, the same way that Teotihuacan in of the Aztecs and the Mayas did not have a historical record. I mean, had a sparse historical record. Using space syntax to understand the esteros and their role in the formation of the colonial urban fabric, in a way, it kind of echoes that. You know, we can see the significance of the waterways through that analysis.
Okay, so there's another question. Have you encountered any beliefs or stories as related to water when you were doing, your studies, or when you're looking at the documents, or when you were doing your research?
Again, sorry, belief stories related to what?
Are there any beliefs or stories that you have encountered related to water?
Well, again, I have to preface by saying that I'm not a historian or archaeologist. I'm an architect and urban planner that just so happened to investigate the historical urban framework, urban fabric. Well, here's a little thing, little funny story. The merlion of Singapore actually has some similarity to the hold on, let me to the seal of Manila, to the merlion found in the seal of Manila. So let me share my screen. I hope I don't antagonize people by showing this, antagonizing the Singaporeans. But you can see here that the original seal of Manila from the Spanish period actually has a merlion. And then if you look further at the logo of San Miguel Corporation, because it's so tied to the history of Manila, it has the same merlion. The same proponent that actually plans to build the expressway on top of the Pasig River.
Correct.
So Manila, San Miguel, the merlion, Singapore, narratives form very easily with these clues.
As the saying goes, same but different.
Yeah.
Okay, I just have a few more questions. So how is the space syntax movement in the region or in Manila in general? Like how is it important, and what's the progress so far? Because honestly speaking, I mean, it is an alien term for me, but based on what you presented and what you shared with us, like, it is rather a very integral and important element of urban studies and urban development.
Well, I think outside, the interesting thing is I just happen to be one of those formally trained in the Bartlett, but in the Philippines, there are other researchers that have learned the methods either by self-study or by reading papers about how to do it. So I'm just a figurehead. There are others working with me actually in my practice that's implementing space syntax in the Philippines, albeit in a small way. I have other colleagues who are studying with me at the Bartlett. One Thai guy from Bangkok as well, and then also from Singapore and from Taipei, and a couple more, quite a handful from China. So this is replicated year on year. No? A lot of students go to the Bartlett and go abroad to study space syntax formally, and a lot of them are coming back to the region and implementing these lessons. That's the groundswell that's needed to push the discipline forward. But it may seem new to us, but the reality is space syntax has been around for quite some time. It was founded in the late 70s, early 80s, the idea of space syntax. And if you just dig deeper online in the journals, there's a whole boatload of papers and research. And as with anything that's knowledge and network based, the more these connections are formed in through research, the more powerful the discipline becomes, and the more the applications unveil itself. Uh, and then all of a sudden, it's an overnight success. It's an overnight thing. It's an overnight big thing. So I won't be surprised if all of a sudden space and tax blossoms even further, and all of a sudden the applications are uh, explode into reality. I was about to say something, I forgot. But basically, what I did say, what I wanted to emphasize is that the more you connect things, the bigger your network, the more powerful it gets. So the more people learn about it, the more the discipline benefits, and the system endures. Uh, I think the struggles that Space and Tax had in the early years, when it was still a very rudimentary body of knowledge, was that uh, the internet wasn't around yet, and there weren't that many people who were learning about it yet. But now, because the internet is there, it becomes more and more enabled by the network effect.
Mm. Yeah, so yeah, whatever. So what you just said is, yeah, very, very insightful, because yeah, I was gonna say that obviously based on what you just shared, moving forward, or when you expand the network, obviously it can be a means of conservation efforts, and then obviously now we see the interplay, right? So with the developments and redevelopments of cities and urban spaces, and how it can be connected. For example, when you redevelop something and you unearth like an archaeological site, which may be important and obviously a part of the historical space of a city. So as I know, like I think just recently in Bangkok, like they were trying to they are redeveloping a section of the I think the old Dusit Hotel, but then they applied the concept of urban archaeology, and then they found out that it is actually a rather important archaeological site. So yeah, you see that interplay of development, redevelopment, and then obviously applying the concept of space syntax or urban planning, and then obviously architecture and engineering and all those other disciplines, and how it interconnects, right? The science and the arts and social sciences.
Actually, it's funny because this is what I was about to say. To an outsider, space and tax seems like a niche, esoteric, highfalutin discipline. But the funny thing is, when I started reading the discourse and going deep into the methodology and the theory, that's why they can't just teach this as a technical course or like a software course. No, they really need to teach it with a deep backgrounder of theory around it. Once you've learned all of that, your lenses change. All of a sudden, everything is space syntax. And it's funny because I annotate what I see by the learnings that I read. And all of a sudden, archaeology, that's space syntax. This thing that I'm seeing, that's space syntax. That's embodied knowledge. That's non-discursive information, and so on and so forth. And, it's such a paradigm shift. And we're just waiting for everyone else to experience that paradigm shift. And then all of a sudden, everything just makes sense. Everything fits together and makes sense.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe a few more questions. So there's another question that came in. What value do you see in the use of big data in waterways management in future pandemics and or climate crisis in the future?
Okay, big data is the much fangled new thing, no? Because the people will always say that data is the new oil. And to some extent, it's true. the problem is, the bigger question is, are we collecting the data? Right? Uh, are we collecting the data, and is the data available for use by researchers to actually make a big enough dent in understanding what these things are, right? Sadly, the answer is usually no, we're not collecting enough data. And number two, whatever data we're collecting is found within silos of either government or in walled gardens like web apps. So I won't be surprised if the ride-sharing apps have a wealth of data about transportation and how the spatial networks change during floods, uh, how certain routes become less used during a rain event. Uh, they probably know that,
Right.
but they're not sharing it because that's where they make the money.
Yeah. And of course,
So,
there's all the data privacy laws as well.
yes. So there's a lot of information asymmetry that we have to get around, and we simply cannot get around those walls without a coherent policy coming from government to say that, okay, it's not just about freedom of information, but you have to request. We're making this available. We're opening the floodgates to research. Places like the UK are like London. No, it was a great experience to do research there because uh, almost all the data, socio-economic data, the granularity of data was eye-popping, and it allowed us to dig deep and to create these correlations and to understand the relationships between the spatial network and the socio-economic trends. I think that's where space syntax comes into play in a data scarce environment like the Philippines or in Southeast Asia, because space syntax doesn't rely on sensors, doesn't rely on counts. It just relies on the spatial network, on the map. If you follow the map and you encode the map as a spatial graph, that's already a good enough baseline. So it allows us to get some quick insights that on which you can start overlaying collected data. So yeah.
Okay. That's about it. That's about it so far for the Q&A. So again, many thanks, Leandro, for sharing your research and insights on this topic. So it is a very interesting sesh because I mean, aside from sharing with us what space syntax is and giving us an overview, it's always important to find out the stories behind the stories and how and how they're actually supported by empirical data. So that's very interesting. And then obviously with what you just shared on Chinatown, like how it thrived and survived through the years. I mean, up until now, it is still an important part of the city, and it has survived the wars, the colonial period. So, and it is still thriving as it is at the present. So, do you have any last words for our viewers and for everyone?
Thank you for making time to join the webinar. I know we've all been webinared out by the pandemic, but it's a pleasure to discuss these ideas with the audience and maybe trigger a change of thinking and some curiosity about the hidden stories of our cities. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, it is timely, obviously, with the constant threats of climate change, and then again with the how it is important to strike the balance, right, between progress and development vis-a-vis conservation initiatives with cities and urban spaces and areas.
Hello to the crowd in the audience that we were able to pull in.
Yeah, well, again, many thanks for this. I wish you all the best in your endeavors. Kapun ka.
Thank you. See you in January, Mitch. And
Yeah,
looking forward.
definitely. So now I would like to call on our special host for today.
Thank you, Mr. Leandro and Michelle. And thank you to all our Facebook viewers and Zoom attendees who joined us live today. We really appreciate your active participation, especially those who commented and submitted questions. We'll be in contact with the lucky winner of who won the SPAFA souvenir very soon. We would also appreciate if you would give us your feedback by taking a few minutes to fill out the SESH evaluation link, which is put in the comment section of Zoom and also in Facebook. This will help us to improve our future SPAFA sessions. And for those who came later or would like to rewatch this session, a recording of it will be immediately available on SPAFA Facebook page. It will be available also in SPAFA YouTube channel within a couple of days. And this brings us back to the end of today's session. Hope to see you again soon in our future sessions. And till then, goodbye.